Okay. Well, okay. So we have Rav Yirmiyohu Kaganoff here and XVI Kaizen asking the questions. And so today the question is Kulot, dinim that appear in the Gemara, but seems like have just don't appear that much in modern practice, at least in the way the Gemara conveys it. So things like my machronim, sleeping in the sukkah, my magulim, wearing jewelry outside an Erev. So the question is, how is it that we have things in the Gemara? The Gemara seems to describe it, very strictly as a requirement, and in modern practice, seem to be, only the frummies do it.
Okay, I'm laughing at your reference to only the Frummies do it, but I will I'll answer your questions. I'm just going to take a pen and jot down the four cases that you mentioned. One was the first was my machronim, sleeping in the sukkah, mayim magulim, or magulim in general. It's not just mayim; it's also wine and milk.
Right.
And what was the fourth one that you mentioned?
Wearing jewelry outside an Erev.
Jewelry outside an Erev. Okay, so each of these has its own independent literature. Okay, and if we want to try to build on it a general principle, we'll see that first, but we'll see that afterwards. But first, we'll start with the specifics. Okay, so it says my machronim chova. Right, you are correct that there's at least one place in Chazal where it's certainly mashma that mayim achronim is more important than washing the tilas yadayim before eating. Washing tilas avrim is takonas Chazal, which is because what's a long reason why it is, which we don't have to go into here now, but it's something that is observed by, I would say, virtually all people who are at least even modern Orthodox, right, observe the concept of netilas yadayim before eating bread. Whereas mayim achronim is observed by, let's see, it's definitely true that there are a lot of otherwise Torah observant Jews, okay, who do not wash mayim achronim. And as you pointed out, even people who do wash mayim achronim, there's questions about the way they do it. First of all, many people wash, only the men wash, and they don't have the women or children wash. And logically, that should be true. Secondly, there's a lot of people who wash mayim achronim with just a little water on their nails, literally almost a little bit of water on their fingers, bottom of their fingers. And halacha says clearly how much mayim achronim you have to wash, and it's not enough. So all of these are valid questions. So what I'm going to present here is a partial answer, which I believe is the correct answer. But it's you may feel that it doesn't answer the question to your satisfaction. But the point's like this: when mayim achronim, the Gemara says, the reason for mayim achronim, the primary reason, two reasons mentioned. Okay, one of them is because of melech stomus, which is apparently some type of salt that was used in the times of Chazal. That it said that if you rubbed it into your eyes, it could be very damaging. And while you were eating, we didn't have concerns that you would rub it into your eyes. It's only that when you finished eating, you might mistakenly rub it into your eyes. So you should wash your hands off to get the melech stomus off your fingers. The second reason is that when you make a bracha, right, you should be making a bracha in a b'kavadik way. You should make a bracha in a dirt when you're dirty, right? Smell dirty, look dirty, feel dirty. Any of those things you shouldn't do. And if your hands are all greasy. Now remember also, if you look at pictures of medieval world, there was only one piece of cutlery on the table. That was a knife, okay? And everything else people ate with their fingers. They drank directly out of a cup or a bowl. We do the same thing, but we don't. When you have a soup bowl, right? Usually, most people do not eat soup like this, right? It looks very much unbecoming, and those who are watching, or listening, and not seeing me would have to imagine what I just did. But today, the habit is to take a spoon and eat soup like this. But that's Western world. Much of the world still eats soup and considers it very appropriate to eat soup by taking the bowl up to your mouth and slurping it in, as you'd say. the Chinese method of using chopsticks
Yeah.
is you hold the bowl up to your mouth and you shovel it into your mouth, basically. I believe that there's a difference between the Chinese way of using chopsticks and other East Asians that really don't use chopsticks the same way. But I may be wrong on that one. But Chinese definitely, just that's how they use chopsticks. They shovel the rice and the food into their mouth that way. We would consider that very inappropriate, probably. But that's a question of style or habit. Now, basically a fork, right? This is the original dogma of a fork. I'm showing up my hands with my fingers. The regular example of a spoon was like this, and that's why it's the word kaf in Hebrew, right? It means a palm and it means a spoon. It's the same word, okay? And that's because that's how you originally had spoons, right? That's how mankind ate with spoons. So when people ate with their hands, which was common until fairly recently when people ate with, right? So your hands got very dirty, and it was considered inappropriate. So it's both a question of the appropriateness of having clean hands and the dangers of melastomas. And those are the two basic backgrounds to the idea of mayim achronim. Now,
so basically, you only really have a.
I didn't finish, so that's okay. If you want to, it's okay. Okay. So anyway, so now today we wash our hands, right? First of all, our hands don't get that dirty while we're eating, for the most part, right? Most of the time we use fork and knife, okay? And most of the time our hands aren't filthy when we finish washing them. If they were really greasy and really dirty, I think most of us would get up and wash our hands anyway. If you just ate chicken with your hands, which is apparently, I'm told, very common practice, and a lot of people like certain types of chicken, barbecue chicken or southern fried chicken. I'm told that the only way anybody ever eats it is with your fingers. And your fingers will be greasy when you finish, and you will wash them off or at least wipe them off with a napkin. Okay. So now we have the melastomas question. Now, what is melastomas? What was melastomas? And in most of the world, okay, and certainly in the European world, salt was mined and not used from evaporated seawater. Okay. Now, it doesn't say, it says melastomas, which seems to imply to me that it's not just seawater. Because if it was, because they all knew the difference between seawater and fresh water. That's no big finish, right? And there's plenty of places in the world where seawater was evaporated for salt. It says melastomas specifically. Now, we know today, right, that the Yam Stone is filled with all sorts of chemicals. Okay? In other words, there's entire industries just evolving around, evaporating off whatever water's left of the melted stone, which isn't that much anymore in the Yam Stone, which is the Yam HaMelech, the Dead Sea, which is gradually disappearing, and that's gradually, pretty quickly disappearing at this stage. And there's all sorts of things. There's potash in there. There's all sorts of chemicals. There's whole lengthy, very extensive industries just developed on the various other things that you can evaporate off very easily from the stomas. I've never done a research on what's in there, what they're doing, but it sounds to me that there's a lot of stuff in there that is probably not so good at rubbing it into your eyes. So assuming this was specifically stone salt, right? And let's assume that, there were parts of times in there. So for example, the coastline of Eretz Yisrael did not, and by Yesheni time, much of the coastline was not under Jewish control. Okay, we know that. If the coastline is not under Jewish control, okay, so where do they get their salt supply from? They probably got it from the Dead Sea, which means that the salt supply they had whatever these impurities are that are in the Dead Sea, and they were probably lots of things there that were pretty dangerous. Now, Rishonim already speak out, right, that if you're not using melastomas, this whole concern doesn't exist. And it can probably be borne out by the fact that today, I don't know, anybody uses melastomas for their salt. Israel uses sea salt, but it's ocean salt that we evaporate off. It's not melastomas salt, and I think that's very.
And even if it were from the Yam HaMelech, they probably would distill away the impurities.
That's right.
Because it probably affects the flavor.
Right. it would be, in other words, you would just, salt is very easy to dissolve, but you could probably, right, get rid of all the other things except for the sodium chloride that you want in there, and do that. So background is that going back a number of years already, people realized that they didn't feel the Gzera Belostomus existed. Now, Chazal made a Gzera. Did Chazal make the Gzera everywhere because of a concern of melostomas?
Mm-hmm.
Or do they make a Gzera everywhere because there are concerns of melostomas and similar other concerns, which is the way they quote the Gra with all these Takanas Chazal, saying that don't think that you got rid of the Gzera because you got rid of the obvious reason. There's many other reasons that Chazal may not have told us that make these Gzeras. Now, the Gra may hold that way, and he does hold that way. But I will point out that Tosfos has more than one instance in which he says that a certain Gzeras Chazal doesn't apply to Zmaneda because the concern doesn't apply.
So interesting.
Now, what do you mean? According to the Gra, so the concern that Chazal told us doesn't apply, but there are other concerns too. And we shouldn't start getting rid of Gzeras Chazals because of another reason that they told us. So that's clearly some type of dispute between Tosfos and the Gra. Okay. There are Achronim that apply the Svara of Tosfos to places that are big Chedushim. I'll just share with you. There's a, trying to blank on the Sefer. I know the author, I'm just trying to blank on the Sefer. The Rav Shlomo Kluger wrote a Parish on Shulchan Aruch HaRechaim. Sefer HaChaim or something. It has a very, not a very original name to it. I think it's called something like Sefer HaChaim or something like that. Something along those lines. The Mishnah Berurah quotes it only 2 or 3 times, which surprises me because, either he had it or he didn't have it. If he had access to it, why is he quoted more often? If he didn't have access to it, well, how did he fund these crimes? So if it either was a sefer he didn't highly prioritize, or while he was traveling, he happened to look up things in places and he quoted it. I'm not sure why. But there was Shlomo Kluger in the halachas of Shrikas Samamonim by Shabbos, okay, which people do keep very carefully, as far as I'm aware. In other words, people are careful about being concerned about taking medicines on Shabbos. And he says something fascinating. If I'm not mistaken, I didn't prepare for this, so I didn't look it up specifically, but if I'm not mistaken, Shlomo Kluger rules that in a place and time where medicines are not usually ground, remember, Shrikas Sama means grinding it. In other words, it was what we would call herbal remedies. Okay, and you went into a pharmacy shop, going back, for most of history, and he had all sorts of these interesting things in the place. And when you went in there, you told him, "I'm suffering from this." Well, the pharmacist was the one who prescribed for you what to do, and he'd say, "Oh, I know. I have a thing in the back of my shop that is perfect for what you need." And he would go get the stuff, whatever it was, and he would grind it for you and to describe to you exactly how to take it, before meals, after meals, how often a day, how much, right? Charge you his fee, and you were paying for him not only for his materials, but also for his knowledge as a scientist or a quasi-scientist or whatever you want to call it, right? And and he would grind it out. So we understand why medicines shouldn't be taken on Shabbos, because you're going to grind them. When's the last time you ground a medicine for anybody, or anybody who ground a medicine? Okay, we don't grind medicines anymore, right? It's not done. And Chazal were not only gozer on medicines that we take as medicine, but even things like getting exercise when you're doing it for a medicinal purpose, right? Or other things, right, that are done that are pretty, all that's included under the Gzeira Bishum Shchikas Avilah, right? So the Sefer HaChaim, and I'm pretty sure that's what he named the Sefer, Hoskins, that today basically, let me put it a little different. The way he understands the subject and the way he rules on it, he probably would knock out the entire Gzeira of Shchikas Avilah or the Yisur medicines on Shabbos because of his ruling over there, because he says the Gzeira would maybe not be applicable anymore this month as that. And the interesting is, I don't know anybody who's makel like that. I mean, I know people who aren't so careful about this area of halacha, but they're usually people who aren't so careful in a lot of other areas of halacha too, or they're not knowledgeable about halacha.
Right.
But people who know and care about halacha usually are makbid on this unless they have specific heterim that they've been told by their Rav, right? And so it's intriguing. Now, why were we more machmir on Shikas Samamonim and truthful on Shabbos than we are on Mayim Achronim? I could say the answer to that is that Mayim Achronim heter goes up back 1,000 years. And the Shikas Samamonim heter, as it is, goes back 200 years, max. And we're less inclined to take on Kulos that are only 200 years ago, as opposed to Kulos that go back 1,000 years and become part of our Jewish custom fabric. So
I wonder if there's another approach we could make, which is that Mayim Achronim is a problem if you have the interaction of two things. Number one is you're eating with your hands, and number two is you're eating melchstomit. And neither one of those, for most types of food in contemporary cuisine, we have. So there's two problems we don't have. And really, Mayim Achronim is only if you have both of those at the same time. So it could be, Samamanim, there's only one thing that we don't do today, which is grind, but we do take medicines. And maybe Mayim Achronim, there's more room to make because there's two things that we don't do.
You can suggest it. Okay, I have no problem with it. Okay, being honest, I don't think so, because I don't believe in the times of the Bali Tosfos, right, that most Ashkenaz were already marked on Mayim Achronim.
Oh, right. And
they ate with their fingers.
And how much of this?
Yeah. So let me just close one or two things, and then I'll take your next question. But just to fill out the thought here, let's say somebody like myself, I'm makbid on my machronim. I know fine Talmidei Chachamim who are not makbid at all. Okay, I'm makbid on my machronim as a rule of thumb. Okay, now I never say anything about members of my family that they should be makbid on Mayim Achronim. There are certainly members of my family who are not makbid on Mayim Achronim. Okay, and many of them have worked with the assumption that Mayim Achronim is only a men's thing, not a woman's thing. Well, why did I not tell the women? Because the truth is that, although I think a person should be makbid on Mayim Achronim, I have to admit to say that the minig olam is not to be makbid. And if the minig olam is not to be makbid, I don't make a fuss about it to anybody. I wash my machronim. I obviously wash my machronim before we bench. I'm not makbid on all the things that people are makbid on necessarily. For example, the fate of people that once you wash my machronim, you don't talk before you bench. I am pretty lax about that one, which you could say, blame it on the fact that I really think that my machronim is not a deal as well as that. Potentially, you could say that. The fact that I never say anything at the table to somebody who's not makbid on my machronim. Let's put it this way. The only time I ever did it, I can remember times where I said it to somebody, and it was only one time somebody who had this thing like, I'm from the German Jewish families, we don't wash my machronim. And I shared with him that the Aruch HaShulchan says that if you're eating sea salt as your salt source, you should wash my machronim. And the heter only applies to people who eat mine salt. Now, I didn't tell you that before. I gave you a heter that's more blanket than the Aruch HaShulchan. And it's because I truly believe that. Okay, but I mentioned this to him just to, he should be aware that there are people who hold that if you're eating mine salt, but if you're in Eretz Yisrael and all the salt is sea salt, you should be more makbid. I just mentioned, but he ignored me. Like those, like well, my family minig, he didn't say anything. It was completely him. It was my family minig is we don't wash my machronim, and that's it. That's stronger than anything else. We are not makbid on my machronim. Okay, we do not wash my machronim. So, but that's I think where the background is, and then you have those who very makbid on my machronim, but they're not because they do it improperly. If you're washing my machronim, so they'll tell you the reason for if you ask them, either they'll blame it on minig, which is always a funny thing to blame it on in these situations, or they will quote Kabbalistic reasons to wash my machronim, which seem to be different halachic reasons, and they feel that their washing of the ends of their fingers is enough to fulfill the Kabbalistic reasons for it. And I haven't the slightest idea, but I kind of doubt that that's true. So, I think that either you are or you're not, and that's pretty much as I see it. I don't know if I answered your question, but you had a follow-up question, so go ahead.
I was just going to ask to what extent minhag is is a major factor in terms of considering this a chiyuv or kind of something nice to do or a chumrah, where
I would say minig is a very strong factor. In other words, the vast majority of poskim, not all, but the vast majority of poskim, whether Ashkenazi or Sephardi, right, create minig as a very, very high priority or definition. And just to give you an example of a similar minig, which you did mention in your original list, which was washing for davar shetigula b'mashka, right?
Right.
Which
yes.
is thing that most people never even heard of, right? People heard of Mayim Achronim, and they know that there are people out there wash Mayim Achronim, but they never even heard of the concept of davar shetigula b'mashka, which is washing, or just for those who don't know it or listen,
except for at the Seder.
Washing your hands when you're eating a food item that you dip in liquid. You put the, you take a like we do at the Seder, when you take something and you dip it into salt water, as a classic example. Well, we do it at the Seder, but the vast majority of mankind doesn't do it any other time. Even though there are posts who rule that way. Now, just to give you a background on it, there's some very interesting pieces here. This one, and though the Rishonim already speak out, the Ashkenazi Rishonim, the same ones about the Mayim Achronim speak out, that a discussion whether davar shetigula b'mashka is a halacha, just like washing your hands before you eat bread, and it's true all the time, or is it only a din in Tumah and Taira? I'm not going to get into the whole sugya why that's true. And if it's only a din in Tumah and Taira, then it doesn't apply. And the whole Gemara, when it discussed it, was only at a time in which people were careful about the laws of Tumah and Taira. And the fact that we still maintain that practice at the Seder is because we continue on a tradition of the Seder and the Seder itself. We know the Haggadah, okay? The Haggadah quotes a medrash that we don't have anymore. The whole big, Arami Ovidovi, right? That whole piece of the Haggadah there. We have Sifrei. Our Sifrei has parts of that Haggadah. But that entire piece that we have that we say in our Haggadah is an old medrash that we only have today kept in the Haggadah. It's in everybody's Haggadah. Ashkenazi, Sephardi, as far back as we go, right? Both Haggadahs have that entire nusach. It goes back to the Mishnah saying v'derish me'arami ovedovi, so it goes back to the time of the Mishnah, but it actually goes back. If you trace it back, it goes back. I wouldn't be surprised if it goes back 2,500 years, which means it's the oldest piece of religious literature available anywhere in mankind. Okay, is the Haggadah. Okay, it predates the Takana Birchas Krishma of Ezra. It might go back that far. I have a suspicion it does go back that far. Okay, it's a very old medrash. It's at least 2,000 years old, that for sure. But it's probably a goodly several hundred years older than that. Okay, now we don't have any literature that late. That's itself interesting. Now that would explain why we still wash for davar shetigula b'mashka at the Seder, and we don't do it any other time, right? Because the Seder still has been hagim that go back well over 2,000 years, and 2,000 years ago, people still kept tyrants. Okay,
right.
Now I had two little pieces on this that I wanted to share with you, which I find are fascinating, which will impact on the idea of davar shetigula b'mashka and see how it's viewed by major halachic authorities. The Chai Adam has at the end in Chachmas, he has a long piece at the end called Matzeves Moshe. Now, Moshe was the Chai Adam's son, who apparently was a very budding gadol b'Torah. Chai Adam was a tremendous gadol b'Torah, who died of illness at the age of 19. Big tragedy. Okay, the Chachmas Adam wrote his sefer on Avelis and related halachas. Right, and he called it Matzeves Moshe because this was meant to be the matzeva for his son Moshe. Matter of fact, nobody knows where Moshe, the son of the Chachmas son, is buried today. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows where he's buried. But anybody who's got a big shaykhus to Sfarim knows what the Matzeves Moshe is, and knows that this matzeva has lasted for his son Moshe longer than his physical matzeva has. For sure.
Yeah, interesting.
Right now. In there, the beginning of it, he wants to show what a great Talmud Chacham his son was and what a great nizar in things he was. He describes how his son was very, very ill, which apparently was the illness which ultimately defeated him. And he was makbid on davar shetigula b'mashka. And the Chachmas Adam says, the Chayyim there says there, that he told us that it's only a chumrah. It's not halacha that you have to keep, and you're sick. Just don't be concerned about it. It's not. You need to eat something, and there's no water handy nearby. Eat it. Don't worry about the fact that you don't have water nearby. You can't get out of bed to go help yourself to drink, to pour water over your hands in order to eat this item, right? Don't be concerned about it, right? So you see how the Chayyim views this, and just a comparison to this is that there's a book called the Shulchan Shlomo. I don't know I don't know if you're familiar with it. Shulchan Shlomo was quoted by the Mishnah many times. He was the Rov of Mir at the same time that the Chayyim was living in Vilna. Chayyim was one of the Dayanim of Vilna, and he was the Rov of Mir. They weren't that far from one another. And the Shulchan Shlomo wrote a sefer not too dissimilar in style from the Chayyim without the Mishnahs on it. In other words, it's sefer on Orach Chaim with the halachas psukos organized for a clear way for somebody to know how to keep the halachas Orach Chaim. Set up the way the Chayyim with a straight halachas, straight halacha, very clearly written. There's one key difference between them is the Chayyim uses his own numbering system, Pal Aleph, Pal Beis, Pal Gimel, Pal Dalet. The Shulchan Shlomo numbers his simanim according to the simanim of Shulchan Aruch. Siman Aleph, Siman Beis, Siman Gimel. But he skips siman numbers when he doesn't want to feel there's anything to talk about in that siman. Okay. And what's interesting is look up every time the concept of Dover Shitzbul B'mashka shows up anywhere in Shulchan Aruch or the Achronim. You're talking about people who are after the Magen Avraham, after the Pri Megadim, after the Taz, right? And whenever there's a discussion of Dover Shitzbul B'mashka, the Shulchan Shlomo doesn't say a word about it. He admits it. It's like it's not part of halacha.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, I'll give you a parallel. The Ramah in Teres Chatis, when he gets to the sugya about pas palter and pas, when you should be makbid a pas palter or not. So there's all sorts of criteria. The Ramah says, our minig is that we're completely makel by pas palter, and therefore I'm not going to any details.
Oh, interesting.
End of discussion. Okay. End of discussion. Right?
Yeah.
Since our minig is we're always makel by pas palter, bread that a non-Jew prepared to sell, right? We're not makbid on it, right? Therefore, I'm not going to discuss it at all. Ignore it. There's no thing about it. No discussion about pas palter versus pas Yisrael. He just tells you if it's meant for personal use and not for sale, there's a problem. But if you baked it for sale, there's no problem whatsoever. It's a straightforward statement of the Ramah. So that same idea is certainly what the Shulchan Shlomo is holding when he doesn't even mention a word about Dover Shitzbul B'mashka anywhere.
Right.
Nothing. And the Chachmas Adam is saying halacha is it's only a chumrah, right? And you can ignore it. So here you've got something that the Gemara does mention, right? And the Rishonim mention, but here at least we have a dispute in Rishonim as to what the criteria is, whether we should quote it or not. There definitely are posts who quote it. And, Ronikim are very makbid on Dover Shitzbul B'mashka. Mishnah Berurah Pasuk should be makbid for Dover Shitzbul B'mashka.
I think Teimanim are.
Huh?
Teimanim, I've heard.
Okay, well, they follow the Rambam. And the Magen Avraham is makbid on Dover Shitzbul B'mashka, except that he gives some heterim that, he says, well, if you're eating it with a piece of silverware, anyway, the whole din of Dover Shitzbul B'mashka doesn't apply, only if you can eat it with your fingers. So, according to him, you'd have an interesting other heter why we're not makbid if we eat things with other forks and spoons and cups, right? Why we don't need to be makbid, right? But I'm just pointing out to you, there's your criteria, right? In terms of that, okay? Now, what was okay? Now the next thing I have is sleeping in the sukkah.
Right. Yes.
Okay. So you're chumayv to sleep in the sukkah. The only heter not to sleep in the sukkah in halacha grounds is the one that, because they lived in cold climates where it was too cold to sleep in the sukkah. There's another heter that you would never say Teishu P'dei Taduru if it was, it's mitzvah, right? Or in places in which it's dangerous to sleep, in the sukkah, okay? But other than that, of course you have to sleep in the sukkah. I know, you're going to tell me that nobody in America sleeps in the sukkah. It's not true. There are people who sleep in the sukkah in America. That it's less likely that people will sleep in the sukkah in America, that's true.
Right.
But a lot of it has to do with the cold. It's in a lot of parts of America. It's pretty cold, right? And
Right.
B is that what's it called? Is the dangers of the modern world where you don't sleep outside your very your fort, because of the fact that there are people roaming the streets that you wouldn't want to encounter. Now, the
Right.
Ramah, however, mentions this as a concern of his that obviously being cold in Poland in Sukkot's time is not unusual, but
Right.
apparently he felt that people just never used the sukkah to sleep in, even when it wasn't so cold,
Right.
right? And he was concerned about that because maybe it could have been that the houses were no warmer inside than outside. So the Ramah has a heter, right?
Mhm.
Which those who want to rely on the heter of the Ramah have a right to rely on the heter of the Ramah, notwithstanding the fact that the Achronim have a lot of difficulty with the Ramah's heter. But there are those who will follow, now the heter of the Ramah only applies to a married person.
Right.
It doesn't apply to someone who's single. So those who have a custom that even in warm climates and safe areas, right, that they don't sleep in a sukkah, right? I'm sorry, I don't know what their heter is. I will leave it at that. Okay,
Right.
it's what you're supposed to keep unless you either have the Ramah or it's cold or it's dangerous, right?
Right.
When I lived in Buffalo, which I did for 4 years, as you're well aware of, we did not sleep in the sukkah in Buffalo. No, that's true.
Mhm.
Okay, it was freezing in the sukkah, and I'm not sure that we were mechuyev. I have questions whether, in retrospect, most of the time we should have made a leisha sukkah when we ate in the sukkah in Buffalo. It
Right.
was
Yeah.
told that if you're mitzvah and you go out to the sukkah anyway, maybe you're putter, right? And you should be making a bracha leisha sukkah. It's not so
Yeah.
pashut, right?
Right.
That if you're putter and you go out to the sukkah anyway, then you should make a bracha. I
Yeah.
just, that was a question that hit me years after I moved out of Buffalo. I said, we were making leisha sukkah every time we ate in the sukkah. And it was freezing in the sukkah. You put on your winter coats, and some people try to put heaters in the sukkah, which is useless usually because the heat goes. There's no roof, so the heat goes right out of the sukkah.
Yeah. I
But
mean, in Puerto Rico, we have the opposite problem,
right, it's too
which is
hot.
that it's very hot.
Right.
So whatever I try to design it so that there's just basically minimum walls and maximum schach.
Okay.
Because if you're in a hot place, it ends up being more comfortable than
Right.
what you'd have in Buffalo, where you'd want to maximize everything.
Right. And the other question is whether you could put an air conditioner in the sukkah. I know of people who've tried to air condition their sukkahs. So it probably depends on logistics whether it's practical.
Yeah.
If you have a very heavy schach, you might be able to practically air condition your sukkah. It might work.
Yeah.
Right. When you connect your lighting, you also connect an air conditioner. They have these portable air conditioners for outdoor use. We had one in Corona. We had one for our outside shul. In the Royal davening. They put one, and the thing was basically because we davened very early and very quickly, because in the middle of the day it gets very hot here outdoors. So we davened Rosh Hashanah Kippur that year very early, very quickly in the morning before the heat. And then we came back after the heat broke. But we had, it was just, it was awesome. And they tried to get these air conditioner blowers from the sukkah. It didn't help much.
So I'm wondering if there's a fundamental difference between a minhag that is lakula and a minhag that is lachumra.
There is, for sure, because a minhag that's lachumra may have, and the Gemara seems to hold in Psachim that has the status of a neder, and it might be a neder that you may not be able to be matir it because you didn't make it. But, the whole point of Hataras Nadar is, had I realized this, I never would have been makabel it. Mm-hmm. But if your father's the one, or your grandfather, or your people in your great made makabel it, they made it because they did. You can't say because if I would have thought about this, I wouldn't have done it. They made it for them, right? So l'chumra, you could have a status of a neder. L'kula, you kind of have to say that we've accepted this heter, and since we've accepted this heter, it might be a problem if somebody's machmir too much, or too much in an overt way, either of yohara, which is somebody, showing off their Yiddishkeit, which the Gemara talks about as a big concern, or the Rav Dessler that I told you about several weeks ago when we began this series about not being machmer on things that you're not required to do so. And in his look at it as a Baal Musar, you make yourself, that becomes your Yiddishkeit. And he's really concerned about that becoming your definition of your Yiddishkeit, or the fact that they therefore think you're better than somebody else. Those are all factors in concepts of Yohara. But I don't personally think that that's nearly as bad, right, on a Kula situation. In other words, everybody around you is not makbid on everybody around you is, and there's a heter, the reason to be made, everybody around you is not makbid on mayim acharonim, and there's a basis in halacha for that. I would dare say that if everybody around you is being make one of these two halachas, a person should be machmer in a way that other people don't see him being machmer. And I'm going to parallel it to the words of Shulchan Aruch by Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin, where he says, after telling you how important it is to wear Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin, he says that the only person who should be wearing Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin is somebody that everybody knows is a big tzaddik, basically.
And is that because there's less of a concern of Yohara by somebody with that reputation?
I guess so. I know it's prevalent practice today is different. Prevalent practice today is that we say, if you're a member of a society in which everybody wears Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin, then that's not called Yohara, because you're doing it because that's what your family minhag is, or that's what the area you're in is. So I have, let's say, one of my mechutanim wears Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin because he grew up in a family where men wore Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin. And as he told me himself, he discovered his Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin had never been kosher. So he wanted a heter not to wear Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin anymore. And his Rav passed for him that he doesn't have a heter. He still has to wear Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin because he thought he was wearing Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin. So it's considered he was makabel on himself, and therefore he has to continue doing so, even though he never did in a day in his life because the Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin he had were never kosher. So,
that's so interesting. I mean, but couldn't you get a blanket heter just by saying that if they never learn the Gemara that says that a person who makes a neder is a choteh, even if they're mekayim it? So if they didn't know that and they thought that making this neder would be this wonderful virtuous thing, when actually Chazal kind of have mixed descriptions of ned and nedarim. So couldn't you just say, well, I thought that making a neder to put on Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin would be a great idea, but actually, even if putting our Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin is wonderful, making a neder to do that is not so wonderful. So couldn't you get a heter on the basis of that?
Not necessarily, because if you're machmir on a mitzvah, there's not always kosher that you can be matir neder on it. Okay. Now, I did not discuss with him what he could have presented to his Rav, or whether he could have tried to get it with our Rav to agree. I happen to know who the Rav is only because he mentioned it to me, but I don't know that Rav at all, so I don't know how he looks at these matters at all. And he also didn't ask me to be his attorney in the matter. So he just mentioned it after the fact that, that it was a curiosity. It was a curiosity because he had a pair of Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin earlier, and they turned out they were never kosher. And he had another pair of Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin, and they were never kosher. And he decided, well, maybe God's telling me I should be wearing Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin, particularly since he was at the time with an element of people that people didn't wear Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin. Now, if you come from a Hasidic background, most Hasidim wear Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin. And if you come from a Sfard background, most Sfardim who have a good involvement in learning wear Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin. The common people don't, but the Talmidei Chacham among them always did, right? Among Ashkenazim, pretty much the only people who wear Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin are usually Rabbanim. We're well-known big Talmidei Chacham or Mekubalim, right? But the average Ashkenazi does not wear Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin, right? But the average Chassid or the average Eidot Mizrach is much more like almost all Chassidim do, right? And the scholarly among the Eidot Mizrach, right? So it's a however you'll look at it, okay. Okay, I think I have to like close at this point for now. So if you want to